Hello, this is Bas Bloem. I'm a professor of movement disorder neurology at the Center of Excellence for Parkinson's at the Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. Very happy to share with you some thoughts on the impact of the COVID-19 virus on patients and their families living with Parkinson's disease. But before doing so, I just wanted to mention some other crucial development in the field of Parkinson's. What you see here is the book Ending Parkinson's Disease. I'm one of the 4 authors on this book. And in this book, we draw attention to the fact that Parkinson's is the fastest growing neurological condition on the planet. It's growing faster than stroke, dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, epilepsy. It's the fastest growing neurological condition. So it's a condition to reconcile in years to come. And we think that this is not a new gene that's suddenly causing this rise in new numbers of patients with Parkinson's. We think that Parkinson's is, at least to a large extent, a man-made disease. Just like the pyramids in ancient Egypt, which are obviously man-made, we think that Parkinson's is related to a large extent to causative factors in the environment. Just to remind you that Parkinson's was described for the first time in 1817, when the Industrial Revolution took place in England. Here you can see a photograph of current China showing their Industrial Revolution, which is there currently taking place. In a paper we recently published in the Journal of Parkinson's Disease, Ray Dorsey, Todd Shearer, Michael Oken, and myself summarized incidence data worldwide and discussed the fact that in China, Parkinson's has doubled in the last 10 years. And we think this is because they are now having their industrial revolution. But it's not just air pollution caused by industry. What you see here is a cartoon from the book showing the use of paraquat. And as you are probably well aware, paraquat is a pesticide used worldwide with profound toxicity for the substantia nigra. The interesting thing is it has been banned from over 60 countries in the world, including China. It is still used today in the United States. What you can see here is the use of paraquat across the United States, which I think is incredible. If you give paraquat to a mouse or a rat, it will develop Parkinsonian signs. It will knock out the substantia nigra. United Kingdom is the world's #1 exporter of paraquat. So they're not using it anymore, but they're exporting it to other countries. In my own country, the Netherlands, we are spraying the little sister of paraquat on our tulip fields every day. It's a minor modification of paraquat, never been tested for toxicity in animal models. And we think that the worldwide use of pesticides, which started basically after World War II to feed the increasing number of mouths in the world, is playing an important role in causing this fast rise in new numbers of patients with Parkinson's disease. And we need to do something about it. In our book, we raise awareness for this Parkinson pandemic, as we have labeled it. We ask for a call for action by governments to cleanse the society from these toxic chemicals. But we also call for better treatments and better care models for people with Parkinson's disease. If you're interested, you can order the book here on this website. And just to reassure you that I'm not promoting my own income here, all proceeds of the book are devoted to efforts to end Parkinson's disease, as you can see in the next slide. We really want this book to raise awareness for Parkinson's as a common, debilitating condition for which urgent measures are needed. In the next slide, you can see your basic summary of what we tell our patients today in relation to the COVID-19 virus. These are measures proclaimed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We don't think people with Parkinson's are at risk, at a greater risk of developing COVID-19 infections. We do feel that they are at increased risk of sustaining the severe complications of a COVID-19 infection, in particular the pulmonary events. This is in part because patients with Parkinson's are typically older, although we should keep emphasizing, and this is again in the book, that Parkinson's also affects younger people. A significant proportion is under 50. My youngest patient is 13. That's exceptional, of course, but Parkinson's can be a disease of younger people. And we tell our patients to not take this lightly, to take every possible measure to try and prevent themselves from becoming infected, and using the usual measures of washing your hands, keeping the arm's length distance, etc. But in the next slide, you can see a paper that Rick Helmick and I just recently published in the Journal of Parkinson's Disease on what we have labeled the hidden sorrows and emerging opportunities of this current COVID crisis. So the immediate concerns is your worry of becoming infected and the worry of ending up on an intensive care unit or maybe dying. The hidden sorrows relate to stress, relate to lack of physical activity, and relate to loneliness and solitude. The paper has been extremely well received, probably because this crisis is affecting all of us. You can see how even the Sunday Times paid attention to our paper. It's been in the top 5% of alt metrics in the last few weeks. So it's a paper that's worth reading. It's open access for the Journal of Parkinson's Disease. And in the next slide, you can see the three main hidden sorrows that are part of this COVID crisis. It's the effects of stress, both acute and chronic. It's the lack of physical activity because patients are now forced to stay at home. And it's the loneliness and solitude because patients no longer see their beloved ones. And I will quickly talk about each three of them. Basically, a summary slide to illustrate the huge impact of stress. And in many ways, Parkinson's is an interesting condition because anything that perturbs the patient will lead to a worsening of Parkinson's symptoms. And stress is definitely among them. Stress can lead to an acute worsening of a number of symptoms, in particular the tremor. All your patients will typically tell you that when being observed, when they're anxious or nervous, the tremor will increase. Freezing of gait is another symptom that will typically worsen under stress. And dyskinesias is another example of a symptom that may worsen under conditions of stress. Another particular concern that we raise in this commentary in the Journal of Parkinson's Disease is that there is some reason to believe that chronic stress, I've just talked about sort of the acute effects of stress, chronic stress may lead to a hastening of the disease progression in Parkinson's. That's theory, needs to be put to the test, but it's definitely a concern that placing the dopaminergic neurons under chronic stress may lead to a hastening of the otherwise already relentless progression of Parkinson's. I just wanted to raise awareness for the fact that we do have treatments to alleviate stress. Mindfulness is an interesting intervention for which the scientific evidence is beginning to grow. I wouldn't say that there is class 3 evidence. It's early days. A lot of my patients resort to mindfulness now, or yoga or other types of treatments, and find this to be very effective. I'll come to the scientific evidence in a minute. Clearly, we need more robust evidence from randomized controlled trials. But mindfulness is one of the interventions to consider. By the way, higher doses of levodopa is probably also temporarily a good way of further supporting the dopaminergic system and reducing anxiety levels. And in the next slide, you can see my good friend Tom Isaacs, the founder and chair of the Cure Parkinson's Trust, who sadly passed away last year. He lived with Parkinson's from a very young age onwards. Incredibly inspiring guy. And he shared a home video with me, which I will show in the next slide. And this is Tom showing his very marked dyskinesias induced by the levodopa medication. But if we wait for a little while in the video, and when he tries to concentrate and relax, I think it is incredible that you can see how Tom is able to completely control the dyskinesias until they are virtually completely gone. And I think it is a tribute to the power of the mind and the will. It's an illustration of what an intervention like mindfulness can potentially do for people with Parkinson's. But of course, we live in a time and era of evidence-based medicine. In the next slide, you can see a paper published last year in JAMA Neurology, which is now one of our leading neurological journals. A study where mindfulness combined with yoga was compared to stretching and resistance training exercises on anxiety and depression for people with Parkinson's. And the results showed that both interventions, mindfulness combined with yoga versus stretching and resistance training, were about equally effective in improving motor dysfunction and mobility, but the mindfulness and yoga had a greater effect on anxiety and depression and spiritual well-being, as well as quality of life. So I've read this paper very carefully. It's not the best of studies. There's a number of critiques. It's just to illustrate that the scientific evidence is beginning to grow. It is certainly supported by anecdotal reports of our patients. And particularly in these times of stress, I think we should take every measure, be it pharmacological, be it non-pharmacological, to alleviate stress and thereby improve symptoms in the short term and maybe help with slowing the disease in the long term. Now, in the next slide, we'll come to the second challenge that patients with Parkinson's disease are facing, which is they are now grounded at home and are more physically inactive. And while all of us are less active than we often dream about, which is powerfully shown in this little cartoon here, in the next slide, you can see that physical activity is, even pre-corona, a particular problem for people with Parkinson's disease because of their physical impairments, their cognitive decline, the depression, the apathy, the fatigue, which hinders them in their physical activities. And now there is the corona crisis to boot, which forces people to stay at home, and probably for the good reasons, as we mentioned before, but it will add to their physical inactivity. And then in the next slide, you see a paper that we published some time ago in the Journal of Neurology, showing a steady decline of physical activities in patients with Parkinson's with disease progression. You can see why we are so particularly worried about this lack of physical activity for people with Parkinson's, because it can worsen a number of problems they are already facing because of the disease itself. There's a number of papers now showing that people with Parkinson's are at increased risk of cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, obviously sleep problems. Insomnia is a huge problem for people with Parkinson's. At least 70% has cognitive decline up to dementia. depression is common, constipation. This all worsens when you're physically inactive. And importantly, there is an increased risk of all-cause mortality. And this obviously interacts with everything that Parkinson's is causing itself. So patients are bit in the tail twice. The inactivity in the Parkinson's causing the same symptoms and leading to worsening. And in the next slide, you can see a paper that we published in Nature Reviews Neurology, summarizing why it is so important to keep patients with Parkinson's physically active. It acts to suppress the motor symptoms. It is good for a number of non-motor symptoms. We mentioned sleep, we mentioned depression, we mentioned constipation. It's all in this review paper. And in the next slide, I just again want to illustrate one particular case, which I find to be very motivating and inspiring. It's Nicolas Koukoulakis, the former European champion in weightlifting. You probably have all heard of him, who became my Facebook friend and shared a video with me, which I'm now showing in the next slide. This is Nicolas walking at home in a crowded environment, showing the freezing of gait. This is typically where freezing happens. He can still run up and down the stairs, still, seemingly effortlessly. He can ride a bicycle. You may know we published a lot about this. The moment he dismounts the bicycle, he's immediately frozen to the ground again. And in the final bit of the video, and this is the most important part, you can see he's still an avid exerciser. And after a period of intense exercise, here you can see it, he walks normally, which I think is just incredible. And look at the brilliant ending of the video. He seems to be totally happy with his exercise. So in the next slide, you see a paper that we published in the Lancet Neurology. Nicolien van der Kolk, my PhD student who will get her PhD thesis this year, was the first author. And this was a very interesting study because we did a home-based trial of exercise. And now in the times of the corona crisis, it is obviously important to think of interventions that can be brought literally into the patient's homes. So this is now using a stationary bicycle brought into the patient's homes, asking them to exercise 3 times a week. And what we did in the study is we gamified the entire intervention. So we gave patients anticipated rewards if they were to exercise. They were rewarded with all sorts of games during the exercise on the bicycle. For example, playing the good old-fashioned Pac-Man game, trying to kill monsters, and had to cycle faster and faster to kill the monsters. In the end, they felt, or they had in fact killed 20 monsters, but at the same time, they had exercised for 30 minutes at 80% cardiac output. Beautiful thing is studies, it was completely blinded. It's the first successful blinded physiotherapy trial in the world. Control group did stretching exercises, but received similar rewards. So both groups felt they had the real deal, but only the people exercising on the stationary bicycle actually had the aerobic intervention, which we feel is critical. And again, home-based, so perfect for the corona timing. And in the next slide, you can see the main result. You see the delta UPDRS on the y-axis. So this is the difference between before the intervention and after the intervention, which by the way lasted for 6 months, 3 times a week. You can see in green that the aerobic intervention group had a minor improvement. It's better to say they had stable symptoms over 6 months, whereas in gray, the active control group worsened over time. And the difference is about 4.2 points on the MDS UPDRS in the off state, which is not dissimilar from an add-on effect of, say, an MAO-B inhibitor or a COMT inhibitor. But now with a home-based exercise intervention. So it may help to stabilize the motor symptoms. whether this is just a symptomatic effect or also a disease-modifying effect, you can't tell from the data. The stabilization might suggest a disease protection, but I want to interpret this very carefully, and I think this is a symptomatic effect. Although, in the next slide, I will share some very exciting new data with you. The study was about 130 patients divided over the two groups, stretching and aerobic exercise, but in 50 patients, we also did state-of-the-art brain scans before and after the intervention, so both the stretching group and the aerobic group. In the next slide, you can see a patient about to slide into the MR scanner, and the extremely cool result is that there was atrophy of the brain happening even during the 6 months in the stretching group, which was stopped in the aerobic exercise group. And there was enhanced functional connectivity between the putamen and the caudate and the motor and supplementary motor area. So this is incredible data showing that with exercise, not only do you stabilize your motor symptoms, the brain shows adaptive plasticity, and this could be a hint. Again, it's not proof yet, but this could be a hint that exercise, home-based, could be a way of stabilizing symptoms and who knows, become a disease-modifying treatment for people with Parkinson's. So in the next slide, just a funny cartoon to summarize that, patients tend to ask us for pills, deep brain stimulation, other interventions, and these are important. I'm not saying levodopa or STN stimulation is unimportant. They're clearly very important for many patients. But lifestyle changes are at least equally important. And I think it's a message of hope to patients that they should not just be dependent on us, but there's a lot of things they can do. But make sure that you keep the exercise intervention palatable for your patients. So to include these gamification elements. And just in closing, to mention the fact that the other next kid on the block, if we talk about lifestyle, is diet. I will be brief here in the interest of time, but the other thing patients can do is resort to a healthy diet to reduce weight loss, malnutrition, constipation, orthostatic hypotension. Many reasons why patients should resort to a healthy diet. I almost routinely send my patients to a dietitian. And just finally, in the next slide, you see this lovely lady reaching out to patients through telemedicine. Patients are now grounded at home, and a lot of these interventions and a lot of the advice that we're giving can be done remotely. The exercise intervention was home-based. Mindfulness can be delivered remotely. Loneliness can be reduced by video conferencing with children or grandchildren. We can listen to the stories of our patients. A large part of the UPDRS, this is interesting to think about it, the tremor, the resting tremor, the postural tremor, the bradykinesia can all be tested remotely. Obviously, you can't do rigidity, you can't do a pull test, so you can't do a full UPDRS, but you can do a meaningful neurological exam remotely. You can give a lot of advice remotely. And in the next slide, you see a paper that Ray Dorsey and Michael Oken and myself published just very recently in JAMA Neurology. A nice title, I think, The Coronavirus Crisis as a Catalyst for Telemedicine. What we're seeing worldwide is an unprecedented adoption of telemedicine. Payers now suddenly reimbursing remote visits. We're seeing that even elderly patients adopting telemedicine approaches. And mind you, we always tend to think this is complex video conferencing. Simply picking up a telephone is telemedicine, and we've done that for decades. centuries. Well, not sure how long the telephone's been around, but anyway, a simple telephone conversation is also telemedicine. So I think we're now seeing how the future of care has been brought forward in an accelerated fashion because of the corona crisis. I think providing consolation, advice, doing remote neurological exams, delivering interventions such as group exercise, group dance classes, mindfulness can be done remotely. It's a service to our patients who don't have to drive the long way to the hospital, sit for long times in waiting rooms, only to see us for 5 or 10 minutes. The future is here. The corona crisis has brought it forward in an accelerated fashion. And just in closing, in my final slide, to remind you about the book. Again, the proceeds are all for Parkinson charities, but in reading and reviewing and buying the book, you'll support the good cause. I think it's an important book and I hope you'll enjoy reading it. I hope you also enjoyed this webinar and I look forward to a post-corona time when we can all shake hands again and meet each other in person. Thank you very much and I hope to see you in person very soon again.